It takes a village to raise a child, and it takes way more than a village to beat Elden Ring for a child. Welcome. This is a challenge run where I try to beat the entirety of Elden Ring without killing anything myself, but different from a typical Souls game pacifist run, where players rely on NPC summons, glitches, and cheese to get through the game. I'm going to summon real online players to do all of my fighting, and we'll see if Elden Ring allows me to beat it without lifting one finger. Just finger remedies. Now, this video is actually a supercut of the run I did last summer. I previously published this whole run as a series that shows every boss kill and highlights every single player who helped or invaded, but that's excessively long and in too many pieces like the Hobbit movies. So this is a repackaged video of the full run in the typical YouTube style. The footage is mostly going to be B-roll, so if you want to fold laundry and listen, I think that makes us all happy. If you see someone with a lance killing things, that's just some bonus footage I gathered on a different character to illustrate concepts. Let's begin with the rules of the run. 1. I can't deal damage, obviously. Only cooperating phantoms and hunters are allowed to hurt enemies in my game. 2. As a related guideline, but not a hard rule, kill no enemies. There are plenty of trap or gravity kills possible. Some of these are permissible where it opens up more content for the run, like knocking down the Sanguine Noble in Snowfield to access Mogwin Palace, or knocking some imps down a pit so the martyr effigy is usable in a catacomb. But in general, avoid killing, even via gravity. 3. Collect all remembrances. There's one remembrance that's a little iffy in co-op that I would personally forgive anyone else who attempts this challenge, but we'll get to that later. Finally, I set a cap of 2 successful summons per player. I wanted to showcase as many different players as I could, and I also didn't want to piss anyone off by making them carry my dead weight multiple times. After 2 summons, we are never ever getting back together. I started this run off not in Limgrave, but on the wikis. I had to check if it was even possible to summon people throughout the whole game. The other Souls games don't play very well with this challenge. They'll have mandatory areas that disallow summoning, and the amount of times you can even attempt to summon has a soft cap limited by humanity or ember, whatever. Looks like Elden Ring just needs you to spend 1 Furl-calling finger remedy to summon help. Checking how to get those, and it's craftable. Awesome. It just needs Erdly flower, which respawn in clumps on the overworld. And the recipe for that is available as soon as I buy the crafting kit from Calais. Perfect. Pacifist Run has the green light on Elden Ring. The next step is to identify the tools Elden Ring gives you for contributing non-violent value, or NVV. This is basically any way I can contribute to the success of the run without directly hurting enemies. If I literally just summoned a helper and did nothing, that would reflect poorly on me and possibly lead to disconnects and make people sad that we interacted. Neither of us want that. So I scanned for things like heals, buffs, and ways to distract enemies off of my helpers. Turns out the Confessor class starts with a Finger Seal and 2 NVV spells, a small self-heal and Assassin's Approach, which is some garbage stealth spell that ended up not helping, but I thought could be good for some trolling. In case you're not familiar, Elden Ring does not support chat, so there's no great way to communicate with players that I summon. I wish I could tell cooperators, sorry bud, I'm running a gimmick. Can you please walk me to the good loot and kill most of the trash mobs on the way to the boss for XP? By the way, if that's annoying and you want to disconnect right now, go ahead, no hard feelings. But it's impossible to tell people that, and surprisingly, none of the gestures adequately convey the full message. So I packaged my gimmick along with my hopes and dreams into my carefully chosen player name, Carry Me Daddy. This is something other players will see, so I packed all the info I could in a concise player name. I considered something more direct, like Pacifist or I Can't Attack, but I didn't think those names would inspire the same goodwill. Besides name, I had one more communication channel, my outfit. So wearing schmancy armor might have accidentally made it look like I was a skilled player who was wasting their time. So to a small extent, I preferred noobier looking equipment in a way that hopefully sent the message of I need your help rather than I am choosing not to help. I doubt anybody cared about this, honestly. Stats were surprisingly a little tight early on. I needed enough faith to cast my spells, enough strength and dex for the skills to function on my weapons, and besides that, I wanted to stack vigor and endurance to stay alive. So while I fart around Limgrave doing minor bosses for levels, let me tell you about summon range. So you can only see summon signs of players who are within 90% of your level minus 10, or 110% of your level plus 10. It's pretty generous. That means at level 100, you could see signs of players between 80 and 120. On a normal run, a player is going to run through an area multiple times, accumulating runes from trash mobs as they make progress. Maybe occasionally they'll suffer a big rune loss, but overall getting more than 1 run's worth of runes out of a dungeon. They also have the ability when they run past a camp or a patrol on the overworld to pop in for some quick kills and treasure. I have no such privilege. I almost never get to repeat a dungeon since cooperators tend to get us through in one attempt. Plus, many cooperators prefer to skip the mobs anyway and just sprint us through to the boss, which loses me that XP, so my level is going to end up lower than a normal person's. Being at a low level shouldn't be acutely scary to me since I'm not the one doing the fighting, but I don't want to end up permanently below the summoning range for the late game areas. If my level gets too far away from the normal level range in an area, I could get stuck unable to find any summon signs. And there's no such thing as farming to catch up when you're a pacifist. It's for that reason, more than any other, that I decided that I should full clear the game as much as possible, completing all the side dungeons and overworld bosses. I may not be able to farm, but I can hit up all the side bosses to at least stay competitive. It's a silver lining that this means more time spent enjoying the game and getting to showcase more cooperators. To help when I could, sometimes I would pop a gold pickled Foulfoot before a boss kill, and I did rush the gold Scarab for increased runes as soon as I was in level range to get summon signs in Caelid, and I ended up in a pretty safe level for summoning range throughout the game. To summon somebody, you need one of these gold summon signs. In Elden Ring, in almost all cases, summon signs are clustered around martyr effigies, also known as summoning pools. While a sign can be placed anywhere, there's rarely any reason to place or look for a sign anywhere besides these pools. Fortunately, co-op is enabled for every single boss on the critical path and something like 80% of the side content. Exactly 2 dungeons in the entire game just don't have a summoning pool at all. There's the Oriza side tomb that has all those teleporters, and the Fringe Folk Heroes Grave, which is at the very start of the game. And Everjails don't allow cooperators at all, even if you drag people in from afar. Then there were plenty of technically summonable, but not practically bosses. Some dungeons, often catacombs, have their summoning pools placed behind the first few enemies, making them a mess to utilize if you're a pacifist. And plenty of overworld bosses could be co-opted if you summon help a literal mile away and dodge invaders for 8 minutes as you try to run, but I skipped many of these bosses since I was pretty sure it would piss someone off to get summoned and run across a whole continent just to carry me through a 20-second Tibia Mariner fight while I cheered on from the stands. The run started off very smooth actually, all the way through Godric before I hit a brick wall. So Limgrave small dungeons went well with highly available summon signs, and all the way through Stormvale I had no trouble finding Jolly Cooperation. But I thought the run might have to get scrapped after Godric because summon signs just dried up like a mummy without chapstick. This was Dark Souls 2 all over again, a game in which I previously completed this challenge. Summon signs just stopped after the first few bosses. Waiting hours for a single summon sign, which can easily go to waste by the way if we died to the boss, isn't going to be feasible for a game with 150 bosses. I started to worry that I'd be throwing away all this effort like I had to do for Bloodborne. That is correct. I actually spent like 25 hours trying to do a Bloodborne pacifist co-op run and had to scrap it because no one can help you after Gascoigne. I searched around and found tons of threads of people with the same issue I had in Elden Ring. They were able to summon people just fine through Godric, then co-op just absolutely flatlined. Some people were saying starting a new game fixed it, or that finger remedies were glitched and you have to discard all your finger remedies and craft new ones to fix it. It took way too much Googling to finally identify the issue, and I'm sure some of you are cringing because you already know this. So aside from character level range, it turns out there's also a weapon upgrade range for summoning. Now, because I'm a pacifist, I did not expect to need my weapons to be upgraded ever, so I'd been cruising along at +0. But you do need to keep your weapons upgraded as you go to stay abreast of the players that you want to summon. So after learning this, I would stick upgrades on my finger seal and shield as I played, and that fixed my issue of summon signs weaning down to 0 after Limgrave. Last note on the topic of keeping up in co-op, I did my best to visit the areas in ascending level order. Even though there's not an official one, Fextra has this nice suggested list of areas with their weapon upgrade ranges, and I stuck to this. Liurnia to Limgrave is pretty clearly the first 2 areas to hit, but then the order becomes a little blurry in the middle of the game, so this list just disambiguated the zone order for me. I mentioned NVV earlier. Let's talk about the options I found for providing value without killing enemies. The incantation list was an obvious place to start. So from my Dark Souls 2 co-op pacifist run, I knew that Force, known in Elden Ring as Rejection, would be one of the best actions that I could be taking. There are also healing incantations, party HP regen buffs, there's Golden Vow to buff party attack and defense, and a handful of shenanigan spells like Darkness, Assassin's Approach, and Shadow Bait. Sadly, there are several enticing spells I really can't get as a pacifist because they require killing a scarab. Barrier of Gold, for example, which gives a big magic negation buff to the party, was tragically scarab locked. Beyond incants, I looked for NVV in the list of weapon skills and Ashes of War, though there's a surprisingly low amount of non-damaging weapon skills. We all knew it would be low. I mean, these are weapon skills after all. They're gonna mostly be offensive, but there are next to zero that I could use on this run. The few I came up with that looked helpful were Commander's Standard's Rallying Standard, which gives an attack and defense boost to the party, and Shriek of Milo's famous Sweet Tea, which I wasn't even sure that I could acquire this sword as a pacifist. There's one weapon skill that broke my heart. The Mists of Slumber from St. Trina's Torch is perfect for this run. Non-damaging sleep buildup? Count me in. But the torch is only available in the Consecrated Snowfield after getting the Halig Tree Medallion halves, and that's not even possible for me to sprint to. My enemies are gonna ditch the whole scene and end up dreaming instead of sleeping. If you ever want to try a pacifist run, I might suggest getting a friend to drop you the St. Trina's Torch early on so you can actually use it. Oh, and this is important. You can't just rush it because Ensha will attack you in Roundtable Hold, which locks you out of doing any of the Roundtable Hold activities permanently as soon as you grab either half of the Halig Tree Medallion. As a pacifist, you have to burn the Erd Tree first, which will prevent Ensha from attacking. Right, the final place to look for NVV was Talismans, and this caused me to make an error for my starting gift. Shabriri's Woe sounds like a slam dunk. The thing says it constantly attracts enemies' attention. It sounds like I could use this to keep enemies from facing me, open to easy attacks from my cooperators. So I snapped it up and got pretty disappointed when I summoned my first helper in the Groveside Cave, and I couldn't get any of the wolves to even look at me. It turns out Shabriri's Woe does nothing for a pacifist. It did not attract plain old enemies, and it certainly did not help draw boss aggro. Its true function is either nothing, or it's something more like attacking an enemy generates 50% more threat. But for me, who was never attacking, this was completely blank. Shabriri's Woe, more like Shabriri's no, thanks. So that's all the planning. Let's talk about the experience of actually playing as a pacifist once you get some help summoned. It was funny. I feel like I could read players' emotions pretty well despite the lack of any chat. If somebody spawned in with a clearly planned out costume and build, they would gesture hello, spam L1s with me as we're running along. I know this person is here to have a good time, and I might impose on them by aggroing more mobs for runes or running down a side path for treasure. Then there were the businesslike players. They were playing more for the rewards, I guess. I knew they were trouble when they walked in. No gesture or a single wave. They would dash ahead on the shortest path to reach the boss and just start blasting. When I summoned in a player like this, I knew not to dick around with Mimic Veil or hold them up with buffs at the boss gate. Beggars can't be choosers on this run, so I'm still very grateful for all the assistance, but these businesslike players were not quite as interesting. 90% of players I summoned belong to one of these first two categories of helpful people, either the fun social gesture people or the businesslike let's go kill the boss ASAP people. The 10% of unhelpful people came in two flavors as well. Several people noticed I'm a pacifist and just hated that fact. They stood idle in the boss room or disconnected out of spite once we reached the boss. Twice I even had people get the boss's hit points close to death before stepping back and refusing to finish the fight, which of course I couldn't do, and ended up having to let the boss kill me, which wasted both of our time. The other class of stinkers were more forgivable. They were simply passive. Listen, I have nothing against being new at the game or dying if you're making a real attempt, but I do think if you have a sign down in a certain dungeon, you should be familiar with the route to take to reach the boss of that dungeon. Several times I had cooperators wave hello, then spin around and wish me to lead them, which is kind of awkward when I can't defend myself and had only touched the dungeon once like 18 months ago. Still, I largely had a great time playing with a huge slice of the Elden Ring community, because you know I love the players, and you love the game. Now, I'd love to include in this video a Hall of Fame callout for some of the nicest moments with other players, but even if I filtered that down to the top of the top, there were so many positive interactions, it would dominate this video. If you want to enjoy the little positive moments I share with cooperators, I honestly suggest checking out the full run playlist after this video. I give a little ranking to everyone I summon and try to mostly highlight the good in people. It's a good time. There are players I initially underestimate who rise up to kick ass. There's a lot of impressive cosplays, and there are hilarious moments all throughout. I had one guy who acquired Scarlet Aeonia before the Margit fight, and I had a guy who was so good at fighting Moog that when I used the shackle on Moog, he just refused to hit him until Moog got back up. There were a million joke builds too. This guy called Fight Knight comes to mind. He was just a knight with iron balls on his fist like boxing gloves. It's really a fun series, just kind of long, and on the off chance it was your character that I summoned in that, it would be really cool to hear about that in the comments. Now, I probably have the deepest thoughts of anyone in the world regarding the summoning pool meta at this point. A big claim, I know. Summons on this run were not entirely luck of the draw. I was able to manipulate fate to a small degree. Some pools were unpopular, like in annoying side dungeons, and I had to settle for the one guy who had a sign down. But most pools had a selection, and I got to be more choosy whom I summoned. So my highest priority was anyone I recognized from a previous successful summon. Like I said, everyone gets up to 2 summons. A few times I got the chance to summon players I had encountered on previous days of filming from earlier in the game, and it was really cool to meet them later on in our journeys and check up on their progress. I also jumped on anyone with a funny character. Someone named Dad Destroyer, yes please. Naked yellow guy named Millhouse, these people were snap summons. Anyone with a lowercase name, though, I tried to avoid. It comes off as lazy to me, or childish in a literal sense, and I didn't expect lowercasers to be as good at the game or as willing to tolerate my gimmick. Now, I was wrong about that latter part, because really almost everybody that I summoned was cool about carrying me. And because I had lower expectations for lowercase name performance, I actually had some nice moments when lowercasers stepped up and beat ass. This one girl, Debbie, was playing with a scythe and a shield, acting pretty timid and taking some hits against skeleton mobs. But when we got to the boss, which was a duo boss of Crucible Knights, so she had a 1-on-2, Debbie managed to solo one of them while I tanked the other, and we even pulled off a swap once I realized that we shouldn't have her soloing the shield one at first. Then once she killed the spear one and we just had the shield one left, she would play defensively until I turned his attention with rejections, then swoop in to attack. We played monkey in the middle like this for several minutes and succeeded with almost no flasks left. I don't know how it gets better than this. She took my hand and dragged me head first, fearless. I pictured some teenager on the other end dropping the controller afterward and screaming when we pulled off the win. So yeah, several nice upsets like this did soften my opinions on lowercasers over time, but I still preferred capitalized names to summon when I had a choice. Okay, this is a section that I wanted to include regarding the nature of pacifist runs. We need to have a little talk, Soulsborne YouTube community. This run had a bit of an identity crisis. Is my main goal to be a pacifist, or is the goal to get carried? There's an important semantic difference. I had originally envisioned the run more as getting carried rather than strict to the letter pacifism. That is, it was more about other players doing the work for me than it was about me avoiding dealing any damage. The difference is nuanced, and it boils down to how active I am during fights. Be too passive and my cooperators would be annoyed at best or self-disconnect mid-fight at worst. I didn't want to just trail behind them 10 meters, heavy armor on and great shield up, chugging red anytime anything touched me. That makes boring footage anyway. Too active isn't my place either. Like in WoW, the healer should not pull mobs. I didn't want to run ahead bringing in enemies since that might burden my cooperators with fights that they had wanted to skip. And yet there are some very active playstyles that are technically pacifist, like rejection spam, as well as very passive playstyles that are not technically pacifist, like tossing a sleep pot. That's what I want to talk about here. I never cared for how the community insists on doing 0 damage as the definition of pacifism, but then people will do a quote-unquote pacifist challenge run where they have no problem abusing gravity kills, glitches, and cheese to kill bosses. Anything is on the table for these runs as long as it does not cause an actual damage number to appear. That just causes pacifist runs to disallow things that any sane person would not consider to be an offensive item, like sleep pots in Elden Ring to put enemies to sleep, or throwing pebbles in Bloodborne. If you try that, Daddy says stay away from Juliet. Just because they technically deal a point of damage on impact, so much cool tech gets excluded from pacifist runs, whereas I think it's very much in the right spirit. I mean, if we're going to be super technical about the damage number thing, then I think poison cloud effects should always be allowed on pacifist runs, since casting the spell deals no damage. It's not your fault if a boss happens to stand in your vape cloud and catch poison status. And yet, poison cloud is clearly not in the spirit of a pacifist run. I'm just trying to say, I think everyone's runs would get a little more interesting if we cared more about intent than fixating on the damage number thing. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. With all that said, I definitely slid from a getting carried role into a more traditional pacifist role over time because I got more and more into abusing rejection. Rejection is overpowered, specifically for a pacifist co-op partner. For 9 FP, you make a short-range blast and a spherical AoE. This pancakes small foes, grounds flying enemies, and interrupts the action of bigger foes up to a surprising threshold of enemy size. Rejection even briefly interrupts many bosses, including Tree Sentinels and Loretta's, and it pancakes Malenia. Even if the enemy isn't interrupted from the cast, Rejection does build up an invisible 15 points of stance damage towards staggering even the biggest bosses in the game. The first few times this happened, I wasn't sure that I had seen things correctly. Maybe my cooperator hit the boss right after my rejection, and it's their hit that staggered the boss. But more and more I saw it. Rejection was, in fact, bringing Colossi to their knees and giving my cooperators visceral attack opportunities. It even became kind of predictable sometimes. Many fights, I spent the whole fight chain casting rejection in a boss's crotch while my ally ticked their hit points down to the 1/3 range without a stagger. Then I'd say on my mic, gee, where's the stagger? 1 millisecond before the telltale swing noise and the boss getting crumpled. Tying this all back to the identity crisis of the run thing, chaincasting rejection during boss fights is obviously a super active role to play, sullying the gimmick of getting carried a little bit, even if it's technically pacifist by the damage number definition, but I think this playstyle ended up being a lot more fun for everyone. I felt so vindicated in my nonsense every time a cooperator hit the visceral off my stance break. It was redemption for carry me daddy, in their eyes, in my eyes. I can't damage the boss with you, but I can sure set you up to damage it for me. Okay, new topic. Overworld bosses. A huge part of this run was cross-referencing my map of effigies and list of bosses, and scrutinizing which effigies could be used for which overworld bosses. I'm pretty sure every single overworld boss could be co-opted depending how far you think you can force your partner to hike, but some of them are very far from any effigy, and it's a gamble testing anyone's patience to run to these. Most effigies are placed in a way where they are clearly intended to correspond to one specific nearby boss. There's an effigy for X-Zykes, and there's an effigy for the Twin Pumpkinheads. But nothing stops you from summoning people at the X-Zykes effigy and dragging them across Caelid to do a distant Deathbird or a Knight's Cavalry fight. I get into this phenomenon a lot more in my Martyr effigy ranking video, but there are some effigies pulling way more than their weight where you can drag helpers to 3 or more bosses from one summoning pool. Of course, dragging helpers around the map carries a greater risk of invasion as you spend more time vulnerable. Let's get into invaders. Invaders were obviously a huge problem on this run. I could honestly leave it there. It should be no surprise that invaders would be a problem for somebody who can't fight back. But what I can say is the majority of invaders were here to grief, not to have a good time. I don't want to hear about when I invade, I make sure they want to engage me first. Bruh, that is a minority stance you have taken. Invaders almost always showed up with meta builds, arsenals of consumables they probably duped, and they hid inside mob camps or boss arenas to ruin our fun. Altus and Caelid especially have high amounts of overworld bosses and apparently a never-ending naughty list of queued dickbags doing invasions. It was evident that the invader queue is longer than the cooperator queue, since I would sometimes have to wait a few minutes to get a summon sign, only for invader to pop in before we took 10 steps. Because of this, Flying Dragon Grail and Great Worm Theodorix, both overworld bosses, were weirdly the hardest ones in the game by a lot, much more so than the expected heavy hitters. Even when we defeated an invader, another one would just pop up before we got the chance to re-engage the boss. Elden Ring really needs more of a cooldown on that. The most heartbreaking circumstance was when a cooperator would die while an invader was connecting to my world, so the invader would spawn in and it's just pacifist me, alone, staring down an invader. These degens never even cared about my name, saw that I was running back toward the Grace, saw that all I had equipped was a shield, and had the thought, oh, okay, they're alone and don't want to fight, I'll go home. Not once. They just went, oh nice, a defenseless 1v1, let me get that free kill. I know I sound salty, but there were exactly 2 positive invader interactions in the whole run out of dozens and dozens of haters. One was a guy called Beggar with a question mark who just gestured with no weapons out and trailed us like Gollum. Then once we engaged the boss, he snuck out Radon swords and turned aggressive at that point. This guy was hilarious and I thought it was well played. I wonder if he would have gone home if we gave him a handout first. The other good invader was just some guy who posted up in front of a brazier in Siofra and played King of the Hill. Cheers to those 2 dudes. One section I want to dedicate some time to is tech I thought would be helpful on this run, but was not. Heal spells are the first thing on that list. Would you expect that? Efficiency was a huge theme for all cooperators, whether or not they were the sprint ahead type. And being efficient, cooperators tend to prepare their own heals when joining a host session. Flask rationing is not really a factor for co-op players. They would rather chug red than stand in place for the 3 seconds it takes me to fire off a heal spell. I was similarly excited to craft Warming Stones, which is a consumable that puts out a gentle heal in the vicinity, but by the time I got the recipe, which comes surprisingly late, mind you, it was long past the time that I was bothering to heal allies. I ran the Holy Ground Ash of War on my shield for a while. This skill puts down a ground circle that gives damage negation and HP regen if you stand inside. It's a pretty nice upside for a boss fight. But I would cast it during boss fights, and then cooperators just wouldn't bother. Now, I don't blame them. Mobility is more important than a tiny buff in most fights, but also the Holy Ground area could afford to be a little bigger without breaking the skill. Now, we talked about the damage number thing. All the throwing pots cause damage, but there are 2 NVV aromatics that I tried, Iron Jar and Uplifting, that seemed okay. Iron Jar might have been tech for invasions, but the slow walk speed was problematic, and I had trouble getting people to sit still for the Uplifting aromatic, or they had just brought their own anyway. That leads me to another concept. I get that people didn't want to hang out for heals, but even for damage buffs, they would rather just run by and raw dog the boss. I refined my strategy to cope. I would try to fire off a rallying standard as soon as helpers spawned in, before waving hello, and I would also cast it outside the boss door where my partners had to sit still and receive the buff, even though I would prefer to do it inside the fog wall since the duration isn't very long. Things got a lot better when I basically turned in buffing for debuffing. So I found the Winged Greathorn and its skill Soul Stifler. I had missed this in my pre-run research, since from its description, I assumed that a, quote, soul-sucking miasma would damage enemies. But when I went to cash in my Regal Ancestor Remembrance and saw this axe, I gave it a second glance and realized that this changes everything. Soul Stifler is effectively an inverse rallying standard, making the enemy receive more damage rather than buffing my allies to cause more damage. And perversely, I had a lot more control over where the boss was than where my allies were, so in keeping with my more active rejection-based playstyle, I was able to run in and tag the boss with a Soul Stifle. Winged Greathorn just completely outclasses Commander's standard as a pacifist weapon. It lasts twice as long, you can move a little while casting it, and the cloud lingers a second so you can actually place it first, then lure a boss to run through. Once I had Rejection and Winged Greathorn, my build and playstyle were pretty solid for the rest of the run. I would start a fight with Soul Stifler, then chain rejections till hitting the stagger. If it's a boss where rejection interrupts its actions, continue rejecting afterward, but otherwise I could stop after one stagger since the boss would die before we got to a second one. And that's how to optimally fight bosses as a no damage causing pacifist in Elden Ring. I teased this way earlier, but there's exactly one Remembrance boss who doesn't play nice with a co-op pacifist run. Placidusax, yes, I'm confident that's how you should pronounce it, does not have his own summoning pool, and the Malakath pool deactivates once you kill Malakath, so you can't drag someone in from there. This is a mistake that I made. Summon signs can still be manually placed for Placidusax, but that's depressingly uncommon. After spending a few hours waiting during prime time and seeing only 2 signs pop up and get claimed by others in the 1 second it took me to jump on them, I turned to Discord. I did get help this way, but that's what we call an inorganic summon in the co-op only Souls community. It's just me. I'm the only person in the co-op only Souls community. And that's probably a good thing. With a bunch of carry me daddies claiming people from the summon pool, there wouldn't be enough kind souls to help out the people who actually need it. I did notice a nice pattern though. There were always plenty of summon signs for the hardest fights, and those players tended to be the most skilled. While it took some waiting and several attempts to beat some of the dumb side dungeons like the Spirit Color Snail, where signs weren't common and the help was probably like, what cave did you say this is, when they spawned in? But actual bosses like Malenia, Draconic Tree Sentinel, and Elden Beast, those got crushed in one attempt. The people who are actually great at the game are leaving their signs not in junk dungeons, but at the bosses who matter, and that's nice to see. The one exception to that is Mohgwyn Palace, despite Mohg being a flashy boss who would normally attract lots of co-op help. I think the area is just so small that people don't spend as much time there with signs down, so if you're ever bored and trying to co-op, consider leaving your sign down for Mohg. There is probably somebody who needs it. Some other random observations from this run. Simply beating the game if we didn't have to worry about Malenia and Mohg could have gone much faster. Thanks to the summon level range being pretty generous, it's probably possible to just rush down the end of the game once you're in the 70s. Rejection. It was most of the time used to contribute to staggers on bosses, but there were 2 times I used it to do violence to NPCs on my own. Once was against Eleonora for the Purifying Crystal tier that counters Mohg's ult, and one against Sanguine Noble in the Consecrated Snowfield since he has to die to activate the teleporter to Mohgwyn Palace. I just sent them off cliffs. It's fitting how both times the game forced me to non-violent violence, it was in pursuit of the Blood God. I'm sure I'm not the only one who cares about this. There are very few head armors that let you show your hair. Carry Me Daddy's bubblegum pink hair is a huge part of her personality, and I found myself very limited on armor that displays it. I favored the Great Horned Headband for most of the run, and put the saved item weight towards heavier pants. Knight's Cavalry are the sturdiest horses. The other horse bosses all get shook when you reject them, but Knight's Cav just shake it off, cause a hater's gonna hate. Mimic Veil seems to be Elden Ring's premier non-violent trolling option. Dark Souls 2 had Unveil, which caused a glowing red crayon to float at the nearest enemy, but Elden Ring lets you turn into a ficus while waiting for your allies to spawn in. A surprising number of other players have this hotbar too apparently, because they would join me in Mimic Veiling without delay. Finally, I got a lot of co-op partners with Souls-inspired names from across the series, but I met a weirdly high percentage of Demon Souls references in people's names. The true OGs are out here offering co-op help on PSN Elden Ring. So, we've been racking up remembrance bosses while I prattle on about the mechanics of wasting people's time. I really want to emphasize how easy the end of this game was. Carry Me Daddy just struts up and claims the Elden Throne, having not damaged a single enemy or boss the entire game. It is quite possible to beat Elden Ring, and most of the side bosses, entirely with other players doing the work. That's about it. Bit anticlimactic maybe? But really there's not much interesting to say about the actual execution of the run. The fun part was the co-op partners themselves. My role was literally just tagging the boss with Soul Stifler, then spamming rejection for 5 minutes on pretty much every fight. My production values were a little bit worse back then, but I would encourage putting on the full run playlist to check out the actual challenge with slower pacing and more focus on the personalities that I summoned along the way. Everybody gets a ranking after we win. It's a fun time. Thank you to my wonderful patrons for supporting my little channel. The fact that y'all showed up so early means the world to me. If you would like to help support the channel, Patreon link is below. Elden Ring will eventually get the as intended treatment, but we're gonna explore something a little more sci-fi before that. Stay tuned. And thank you kindly for watching through to the end. I'm happy to make videos for you. And happy 2-year anniversary of Elden Ring. There's not much left to cover in terms of outro, so bye.